Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and the supreme leader in Iran are all old men. There's no guarantee that any of these people will be around in 5 or 10 years' time. So it's difficult to gauge exactly what's going on. I'm sure that Putin will be giving China anything that it needs up to a point to keep the war effort going. Because I think at the moment, Vladimir Putin's agenda is topped by continue the war against Ukraine, because there's still a chance, and I think it's important to remember, there is still a chance Russia can win this. I think exactly how big a chance is another matter. So I think that's Vladimir Putin's priority. But I think the fact that they're talking about defense spending coming down does mean there is a recognition in the Kremlin that things are going to be a bit sticky over the next 5 years, up to the end of the decade, if that's the kind of time frame we're talking about.
Do you think that Putin is doing deals with the likes of China and India to get their support or to get the cash from them today that he's not going to be able to live up to and pay back properly in the future, and it's going to create more friction between them rather than ease things off? Or is he just mortgaging big chunks of Russia away to the likes of China?
I think it's difficult to tell, because this sort of axis of this alliance of evil, or autocracy Inc., as Anne Applebaum has called it, is a very weird sort of conjunction of interests, because the four major countries we're talking about, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, are held together not particularly by common positive interests or by ideology or by culture or by history, but by the fact that they are against what we perceive as the interests of the West, and particularly the United States. So they're a kind of, they're the anti-American gang. And that can be enormously powerful. Strength in adversity against a common enemy is a very powerful binding force. But it does mean that when it comes to these intricacies of relationships, in terms of trust, in terms of what you think is going to happen 5 or 10 years down the line, particularly when you've got, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and the supreme leader in Iran are all old men. There's no guarantee that any of these people will be around in 5 or 10 years' time. So it's difficult to gauge exactly what's going on. I'm sure that Putin will be giving China anything that it needs up to a point to keep the war effort going. So I think at the moment, Vladimir Putin's agenda is topped by continue the war against Ukraine, because there's still a chance, and I think it's important to remember, there is still a chance Russia can win this. I think exactly how big a chance is another matter. So I think that's Vladimir Putin's priority. But I think the fact that they're talking about defense spending coming down does mean there is a recognition in the Kremlin that things are going to be a bit sticky over the next 5 years, up to the end of the decade, if that's the kind of time frame we're talking about.
Well, we also had the Chinese say to a senior EU representative that they didn't want Russia to lose because it would allow the United States to focus all its activities and efforts into what China is doing. Do you think that will have a marked effect on the way China continues its support to Russia? And do you think they're really concerned about what the Americans would do to try and stop Chinese influence around Southeast Asia and elsewhere?
I think from the Chinese point of view, clearly Ukraine is a sideshow. Beijing doesn't care what happens to Ukraine, except insofar as it has implications on Beijing's security. Now, clearly, if, for example, Ukraine were to collapse and Russia were to take over, and America were to step back and say, well, we did our best, but what's done is done, that would leave America completely free in the kind of Elbridge Colby school of thought to devote itself to Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, and particularly Taiwan. I think there are a number of things that we need to consider. The first is, and this is a terrible cliche, but like most cliches, it has some truth in it, the Chinese think much further ahead than we do. Xi Jinping, who is now basically going to be president for life, sees as he would call it, the reunification of China and Taiwan as an essential part of his mission and his legacy. But that doesn't mean he's going to be pressured into anything. I mean, my view is still that there will be some kind of confrontation really quite soon. I would have thought before 2027, 28. Maybe not a hot war, but some kind of confrontation over the states of Taiwan. but that's what the Chinese are thinking about, and they will think of everything else in relation to that objective. The difficulty with the American approach to Taiwan is we really don't know what it is, because Donald Trump, on the one hand, clearly thinks China is his biggest threat. At the same time, he harbors this recurring idea that Taiwan is on a long list of people who have done him wrong or who have cheated America somehow because they stole our chip business, he said, which is utter nonsense, but the veracity of it is immaterial. And so he's reluctant to say wholeheartedly that he would defend Taiwan. He said that, well, Taiwan's a few miles off the Chinese coast and it's thousands of miles from us, the implication being, why should we care? And of course, the agreements that are in place between China and the USA are not commitments so much as abilities to provide support. America does not have to go to war to defend Taiwan. There is no piece of paper which says that. What America is obliged by treaty to do, what that means with Donald Trump in the White House is not the matter, is that it has to supply Taiwan with arms and equipment for self-defense. Now, if we look at it more broadly, if you were trying to act rationally, then you would think the relationship with Taiwan, the support for Taiwan, is critical because it plays into the relationship you have with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, that whole network of American allies, which allows America to operate interests in the Pacific. But we know that's not how Donald Trump operates. And so he has this yin and yang of America wanting to be strong, but at the same time, not really seeing Taiwan as something that is something he should get out of bed for. And I think the Chinese, clearly, if I'm telling you this on Times Radio, then the Chinese know it. So everything that Beijing does will be viewed through the lens of its own interests, and particularly its own interests in terms of Taiwan. And I think that's how we need to understand them looking at Russia and Ukraine.
Well, and Xi Jinping, as you said, thinks in longer terms. So he'll think in multiple generations. And he knows that Donald Trump's got 4 and a bit more years, and that's it. You talk very much about the budget, and it's emphasizing the cost of war to Russia, and Russia looking at reducing its defense budget. One of the things you've written about beforehand is the financial disparity that there is in war. We're now seeing relatively cheap drones been able to destroy multi-million-dollar worth pieces of equipment. Some of them are irreplaceable because the production lines don't exist anymore. Kyiv is doing the same. Has Kyiv successfully inverted the economic pressure that there is in its approaches back to Moscow, which is why Putin is trying to suggest we need to reduce our budget and therefore stimulate his military to go for these cheaper weapon systems that seem to be having a good, if not better, effect than the more expensive one?
I think they've gone a long way. I mean, I think what's fascinating is the resourcefulness that Ukraine has shown in terms of developing technology and industry, the pace of change that they've been able to keep up with, which frankly puts most of the rest of the West to shame. And the way that they have, I think, Russia has also come a long way in terms of understanding how unmanned platforms work and how they interact with more traditional types of warfare. But I think Ukraine has generally kept a sort of edge in terms of innovation and practice. There's a lot of, if you look at how Russia has behaved in military and tactical terms, there is a strong whiff of sort of the early days of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, where you have very clumsy, very reactive military responses on the Russian side, and their enemy is much more flexible and much more agile. I think this idea of the sort of disparity is one that's developing incredibly quickly. Back in 2022, we were talking about, the tank is dead. There is no more future for the tank because this drone can destroy it. And I think, armored warfare now looks very different from the way it did 5 years ago, because you can't have a 70-ton Challenger 2 out in the open because a 10,000-pound drone at best will destroy it. At the same time, that's not really teaching anything we didn't know, because we've known that since at least the Second World War. The problem that the Germans had after D-Day was that they couldn't move their armor during the day because they had no air superiority. So there is an element to which it's the evolution of that. But I think what's unclear is where we're going to end up with, do we end up effectively with drone-on-drone warfare? What Thomas Barnett calls the military singularity, where you have essentially people behind the lines on both sides having this weird kind of proxy robot war almost in the middle. And what does that say about warfare? What does that say about the occupation of territory? What does it say about ethics and psychology? Is quite an interesting issue. But I think Ukraine has done well to push back against Russia's response to it. Russia has put a lot of money into drone technology. It's also bought a lot of drones from Iran, as we know. And I think one of the echoes of the First World War that you get from the conflict in Ukraine is that you have commanders who don't know what kind of war they're fighting, and what will be decisive, or at least one of the factors that will be decisive ultimately, is how quickly they learn. And in those terms, if I had to put my money anywhere, it would be on Ukraine rather than Russia. But it's a learning process all the time. We don't know what next week or tomorrow holds.
Yeah, well, interestingly, on the learning process, I've read that Ukraine is going to start to open drone factories in the United States and transfer some of its drone technology to the United States. And there was a tweet appeared on the US Army website this week that said, "Hey, have you ever seen a drone drop a grenade before? Look at the US Army do this for the first time ever." And then they suddenly looked at all the comments that were coming in and the posts that were coming from Ukraine, and suddenly went, that doesn't make us look very good, and they took the tweet down. But that shows the disparity that there is between, supposedly the strongest military in the world and Ukraine are actually fighting a conflict. But looking at the furry activity that has been over the last sort of 48 hours, the intense air attacks that are going into Kyiv, Kyiv's attacks against Russian critical infrastructure and railway lines and all the rest of it, this 50-day drive for weapons, the peace talks that we both think are going to stall today. We might get an agreement on a few more prisoners being released. But what's your biggest takeaway at the moment on where the state of this war is? And do you think we're going to be talking about it for another 18 months, 2 years, longer?
I think there's a good chance of that. I think the worry, in a sense, is that it settles down into a kind of frozen conflict. Because that helps nobody. It doesn't deter Vladimir Putin, which is one important consideration. It would leave Ukraine in a very difficult position in terms of economic development, in terms of democratic development, if they've effectively got a border with Russia, which is a semi-war zone. At best, we might hope for some kind of demilitarized zone like they have between North and South Korea. The problem in terms of finding some kind of even interim solution is that to reach some kind of peace settlement, you need to be able to do one of two things. You need to be able to trust the other side, or you need to be able to bully them into doing what they've said they'll do. And we know that neither of those apply to Russia at the moment. I think this could be going on for another year. It could be a matter of ebb and flow in terms of the severity of conflict. As peace talks come and go. Bear in mind, the Korean War hasn't ended yet. There was only an armistice signed in 1953. The war has not fully concluded. But I think the problem is that we've seen that when the shipments of weapons were suspended from America to Ukraine recently, Vladimir Putin and the Russian armed forces did exactly what they were bound to do, which is up the ante and start very heavy airstrikes against Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities. They've kept doing that. If we can get enough equipment to Kyiv to upgrade their air defense back to somewhere where it was, then that would be great. But I think we need to be, I'm sure the Ukrainians are already thinking this, but I think Europe needs to come to the realization that in terms of defending Ukraine, it's not just about air defense, it's about striking at Russia. It's about stopping Russia being able to do what it's doing now. And you saw that brilliantly with the drone strikes on Russian airfields, one of which was virtually on the Chinese border. It's thousands of miles away. That was an outstanding, absolutely breathtaking piece of military theatre as much as anything else. But I think it's interesting that you've seen Russia basically throwing all the ordnance it can get vaguely in the direction of Ukraine, whereas Ukraine is striking at, as you say, critical infrastructure, railways, bridges. There is clearly a much more sophisticated military operation going on in Kyiv, but we know that sophisticated military operations don't always win. I think if you have a spectrum of how this will pan out, a complete Russian victory is possible, but I would hope unlikely, because I would hope that if it hoved into view, Europe would finally wake up to the fact that this is unacceptable. I think a complete Ukrainian victory, whatever that would mean, is virtually impossible, because I don't see Ukraine getting the 20% of their country back. So I think we're sort of looking for that part of the dial in the middle. And I think we haven't yet reached a place where there's anything tangible that we can say this is acceptable for Ukraine to live with. And will put a sufficient dampener on Vladimir Putin's ambitions, because he is an imperialist. He wants Russia back, and he's not going to stop at a bloody nose in Ukraine.
Well, sad that it is, given the price that the Ukrainian people are paying, and the Russian soldiers are being forced to pay by Vladimir Putin. It gives us a perfect opportunity to talk again and again and again. Eliot, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Frontline.
Pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.